This is an instructional video showing you how to make the bamboo handle bag. The handles and the instructions are available for you to buy from debbieshawsewing.com. The details are in the description box underneath the video. So just the handles and instructions to buy. You can choose whichever fabric you like. I've used a canvas for this one with a cotton lining. You'll need a couple of buttons to cover for the flap. Some wet glue. I'd suggest a Glutamine HT2. You'll need a strong wet fabric glue. And an interfacing, I've used Vliseline H640 for this one. It's quite a roomy bag. It fastens with a magnetic snap. You'll need one of those as well. And it's got a couple of pockets on the inside. You could add more if you wish. So it fastens over like so. And that, I think, is quite a stunning bag. There is a tip at the end of the instructions. I don't show you in the video, but it is on your instructions on how you can attach a clasp and a strap if you prefer to use this with a shoulder strap, and that's what it's going to look like. So go get your instructions and your handles, choose your fabric, and let's get sewing. So I've got all of my ingredients to make the bag ready. So I have 2 flap pieces from the outer fabric, 2 flap pieces from lining. On the reverse side of the outer pieces, I've put my H640 interfacing. That's fusible fleece. Those are my 2 main outer sides with the fusible fleece on the wrong side, and 2 lining pieces cut to the same size. There's my pocket pieces, my bias binding I've already made, and I've got my 2 handles, magnetic snap and buttons to cover as well. So let's start off by making up the flap. So I'll put all these to one side for a second. Now if you have some spray adhesive, it may be a good idea to just spray the back of these and hold the 2 pieces together. Or you could use a few dots from a fabric glue pen, and if not, just plenty of pins. Oops, that's rather a large lump. So these go wrong sides together. I will secure that with a few pins as well. And then we're going to put the bias binding just around the edge. Now it is important that your bias binding is cut on the bias because we're sewing around a curve. So don't cut that on a straight line. Because otherwise it's going to really kind of pucker up and stretch as you go around the curve. And I'm going to sew my bias binding from the right side, because you're not going to see the back of this. The flap's fastened down, so you're never going to see the underside. So I'm just going to press this binding in half again, because that's going to make it easier to slip around the edge of the flap. If your fabric doesn't crease too well, then use a little bit of spray starch or best press just to give that a nice crisp finish. And I'm going to use the same thread, the same colour thread as my binding, so it doesn't stand out too much. Okay, let's bring in the machine. And I'm simply going to wrap the binding around the edge of the flap and then sew quite close to the fold here. I'm not going to pin this time. I find it easier not to, but if you want to put a few pins around there before you sew, then if that works for you, that's absolutely fine. So let's just cup this around the edge, nice and snugly. And then we'll sew. Again, take your time with this, stop every now and again and just make sure that you're keeping the binding straight and neat around the edge of the flap, that you're getting all layers together there. Now when you come to the curve, you can pull a little bit to make the fabric sit flat, but don't pull too much because it will kind of pucker up a little bit. So just keeping the crease of the binding right on the edge. And again, stop every now and again as you're going around the curve. Stop with the needle down. And just keep sewing all the way around. Because you don't have to have binding around the edge. If you preferred, you could simply sew the front and the back of the flap right sides together and then turn it the right side out and top stitch. That would work particularly well if you have a different coloured flap or a contrasting flap to the main fabric. I think when you've got the same colour or the same fabric for the flap as the bag, then the contrast of the bias binding just makes the shape of the flap stand out that little bit more. Right, almost back to the beginning or to the end. Cut my binding a little bit too long, so let's snip that away. And that's how the flap's looking. So it looks really nice and neat. And then we'll do the same with the second flap. So those are the flaps finished for now. And again, don't worry if the back doesn't look as neat as the front. You're not going to see the back when it's on the bag. Now let's take our two outer pieces and I'm going to quilt these. You don't have to, if you don't want to, if you prefer not to. But I think it does give an extra little bit of interest. But we're just going to do this a quick way, and I'm going to use 60-degree diamonds. So there's my 60-degree line on my ruler. So I'm going to line this up with the edge or the bottom of my fabric here and draw a line. And then I'm going to make these 2 inches apart. So let's flip this over now and line the ruler up at the 2-inch mark with the mark that I've just made, and then we'll cover the rest of the fabric. Now do a test first of all. I always say that when you're using a friction pen, as I am here, because they're not really designed for fabric. Tend to only have a problem with them fading fabrics on colours like red, or maybe plain fabrics that can leave a slight mark when you iron them away. On a pattern fabric like this it won't matter too much, but it may be an idea just to do a little bit of a test first. And if it does mark, then maybe a chalk would be a better option for you. Now in the opposite direction, so there's my lines going in this way diagonally, I'm going to use the opposite 60-degree line here and go in the other direction. And I quite like 60-degree diamonds like this. It's a little bit different to just a square. And a larger bag like this can take the line spin a little bit further apart, so it's quite quick to actually quilt these as well. And I'm going to lengthen the stitch on my sewing machine to around about a 2.8. You can go for a longer stitch when you're quilting. And sew down all of the lines. Personally, I like to start across the centre or thereabouts and quilt in the same direction if I can. So just following those lines that I've just drawn on and continue until both sides are completely quilted. And I just like to turn this over and make sure from the back that I've sewn over all the lines, because sometimes, particularly with the pattern fabric, you can't see terribly well across the front, and because I've used a friction pen I can now just iron the guidelines away. And of course we need to do that on both pieces. You could use a thicker stabiliser as well. This would work well with a Bosal if you didn't want to use an H640, or just with a wadding on the back, but something with a little bit of depth to it to kind of show the stitch lines. Works best, I think. There we go. Right. So now we're going to take the flap We'll fold this in half so that I can mark the centre point, and I'm just going to put a little snip, if I can find my scissors, just into the seam allowance at the top here. Same on this piece. That just needs trimming back slightly, just across the top there. That wasn't quite straight. Right, so we'll put a little snip in the top of this one again. If you wanted to put a pin in there or a mark with your friction pen, that's fine. And we'll do the same on the flap pieces. One there, and the same on that one. And then let's match these up. Now we're going to go wrong side of flap to right side of bag, which is the opposite way to if this was going to be a proper working flap, because of course then it would fold over to the other side. So let's pop a couple of pins in. And the same with this one. So match up my snip marks. Couple of pins. And I'm just going to sew across the top close to the edge, so within the seam allowance, just to hold that in place while we put the rest of the bag together. And pop those out. And the same with the second side. Then we'll make up the inside pocket. Now the reason I've put on your instructions to use 2 pieces of fabric was because it made a little bit more of my fabric when I was cutting it. But if you wanted to use this as 1 piece and fold it in half, then of course that would work as well. So I'm just going to sew all around the edge, but leave a turning gap of about 3 inches or so, just in one side, so I can turn this the right side out. If you're using a directional fabric for this, then the turning gap is going to be in the bottom. And we'll snip across the corners. That cuts down on the bulk and allows the points of the corners to remain pointy. And then turn this the right side out. You hear the pigeons on the roof. It is quite musical here when the birds are in song. Pigeons don't have the prettiest noise, but it's nice to listen to. And push that into your point. Just not your scissors or anything too sharp that you're going to pierce the fabric with. Knitting needle is really handy for things like this as well. Right, back to the iron again. I'm just going to press with the seam on the edge. Fold in the edges of the turning gap. Remember, the turning gap was in the bottom, and I'll top stitch now across the top. Then we'll take one of the lining pieces And I'm going to fold this in half and crease it to mark the centre. Fold the pocket in half, crease it to mark the centre, and then place this over the top. The measurements will be in your instructions. So a couple of pins in here. Now in the bag that I made in the instructions, I left this as one pocket, but I think this time we could sew a dividing line down the centre, and that's going to be big enough to put my phone in. You could make pen pockets if you wanted to make those pockets even smaller, so I'll leave that up to you. So just secure the end of the pocket there. Sewing quite close to the edge of the seam, and then when I go across the bottom here, that's going to close the turning gap. So I didn't need to sew that separately. Back down this side. And a back stitch at the end. And then one line straight down the centre to divide it. And a back stitch. Now this time we're going to snip those away. We're going to sew the two lining pieces right sides together. Leave a turning gap in one side and don't sew these cut out corners. So down the sides, across the bottom, turning gap here. And then let's take those cut out corners and pull the two edges away from each other so that the base seam is sitting on top of the side seam, and we'll sew straight across, and I'm just going to squish the seams in opposite directions. And the same on this side. So open up the square, side seam on top of the base, and squish. And then we'll need to do the same with the outer fabric. Now the reason I've done it this way, instead of sewing the lining to the outer bag in one piece and then the two both sides together, is because you may want to put a shoulder strap on the side. So if you do, then you'll need to have a flat piece at the side seam to put the tab over the top. If you were to do it the other way, and how I normally make a bag would be to sew the lining to it, you don't get the opportunity to have that space at the side seam to put that tab. So if you are going to make a strap, sew these two pieces together first of all, and then I'll show you where to apply it, because you don't have to do that, but if you do want the option, then have a look at the bottom of your instructions and there'll be a tip there on how to make a strap for the bag if you want one. Of course, this time I'm not going to leave a turning gap, so I'll sew all around the edge as I did previously, leaving out those cut out corners, and then we'll square the base off in the same way. And let's turn this the right side out. Right, so that's how we're looking. Let's sew the two pieces together. Now again, if you are going to put the tabs on the side for the strap, as with this bag, Those will go on at this point. So again, your measuring instructions are in the instructions. It'll be a tip at the end. The tab needs to be sewn on facing downwards over the seam at the side, and then we'll drop the outer bag inside the lining and sew the two pieces together. So the lining's inside out, the outer bag is the right side out. So let's push this inside. Make sure the flaps are inside. And then match up the side seams. Again, if you want to pin, then do so. And we'll sew all the way around the top. Now you could use the free arm on your machine if you wish. I find it just as easy to sew kind of on the inside of the bag, but if you prefer, then take the accessory compartment off your sewing machine and just slip the top of the bag over the bed of the machine and just sew all the way around the top. Then we'll turn the whole thing the right side out. So I'll just make sure the corners are pushed out down here. Pull the sides of the turning gap away from each other and you'll find that the edges curl over, and then we'll just sew that on the machine to close it. Then we'll push the lining inside the bag. And you can press again at this point if you wish. We need that seam to sit right on the edge. And then we're going to sew all the way around with the flaps up, all the way around the top of the bag. So I think this time I will take the accessory compartment off and use my free arm. So just feed that underneath. Keep manoeuvring this so that the seam is right on the edge. I can lengthen the stitch again. I've gone up to a 2.8 again. And I'm just keeping the fabric away from the seam so it sits nice and flat. So that's what we have now. Now to cover my buttons, I've cut a piece of fabric to approximately twice the size of my button. It doesn't have to be exact, doesn't have to be perfectly round. And I'm going to just make a running stitch all around the edge. Now the nice thing about covering buttons like this is that you've got perfectly matching coordinating buttons. But if you've also got some buttons in your button stash that you don't like, that you're not going to use, or they're odd, then this is an ideal way of using them up. If your button has a deep cup in the top of it like that, use the back as the outside. And if there are too many ridges in it, or you can see the holes through the fabric, then just cut out a little circle of wadding to the same size as the button and pop that on the top before you put the button inside here. So let's place that inside and pull that up together. And then I'm just going to put a few stitches from one side to the other just to secure that. And again, I'm just going to glue the buttons on. They're not purposeful buttons, so they're going to stay in place very easily with a little spot of glue. So I'm just going to keep sewing over that until I bring the ends all the way around the edge and make that nice and tight, and then we'll glue it on. Okay, so let's take again my HT2 glue, nice big blob, and cover the back of the button in the glue. And then this, you can measure if you like, you can do it by eye if you're confident, is just going to sit right in the centre of my flap. And then we'll do the same on the other side. Now the magnetic snap needs to go from the lining side all the way through to the outside. So let's just measure and mark where that's going to go. So halfway through the bag, you can turn this inside out if you find that easier. So that would be 5.5 inches in the centre here. Let's just put a little mark there. And make your 2 lines through the back of the snap, and then we're going to cut all the way through. So you can either use your quick unpick for this or a very sharp pair of scissors. I'm just going to fold that in half and snip. Make small snips to start with, because you can always make a small snip bigger. I'm just going to go over that with my unpicker. That hasn't gone quite all the way through. That's it. So smaller holes. And then pop one side of the snap through here and put the back on the other side. And don't worry about the back of the snap being on the outside of the bag, because when the flap's folded over, you're not going to see that. And then we'll fit the opposite side to the opposite side of the bag here. And then I'll show you how to fit the handle. Now I've glued my handles in. I'm using HT2 glue, which is incredibly strong. If you prefer to sew, then you can do, but I do suggest that you put a little bit of glue across the top of the handle just to hold that in place, because if not, we're going to slip the flap through the handle. It can move from side to side like this, and we don't want that to happen. So if you're going to sew, I would glue anyway, just inside here across the top of the handle. And then you can sew a line all the way across here. You can do that by hand or machine. Do be aware that if you're sewing all the way through to hold that in place, you don't want to be hitting the magnetic snap or the pocket on the inside. Maybe easier just to do a few hand stitches underneath here, just to hold those two pieces together. But I'm just going to glue, because it's quite strong enough and secure enough to hold all of this in place. So I'm going to, first of all, let's lift that up out of the way and put a drizzle of glue just across the top of the handle, and then fold that over. And I want the handle to sit just on top of the edge of the bag there. And I can keep mashing this up, just making sure that we're sitting all nice and centrally. And then I'm going to put a nice big blob of glue right in the centre here, and fold that over. Now when this is dried, you may want to add another little bit of glue at the sides, just to hold the side of the flap down as well. But again, if you're using HT2, I love this HT2 glue, it is incredibly strong. This is the one that I would use in metal bag frames, so it will take quite a lot of weight. Okay, and then flip it over. I would leave, and then we'll flip that over. I would leave that to dry first of all, but let's put the second lot of glue on here, and again fold that over, wiggle it so that the handle sits just on top of the bag, and I'm getting right down to the end of my glue tube here, and another nice big blob of glue just on the underside there. And then do leave this for a few minutes to dry before you start to use the bag. So that's my bag finished, and as you can see, it's quite roomy, really useful. 2 little pockets on the inside, fastens with your snap. And again, if you have a look at the end of your instructions, you will see a tip on how to attach a shoulder strap if you wanted to do that as well. So I hope you enjoy the bag, I hope you enjoy making it, and I hope you enjoy using it. I shall see you again next time. Bye bye.